Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 of C.L.R. James, A Political Biography by Kent Worcester. Chapter 3 is titled Education, Propaganda, Agitation. This is the beginning of part 2 of the book, so there's a little introduction for part 2. Or maybe not an introduction, it might just be a quote. It looks like it's just a quote. Quote, "Let us not forget that in the Negro people, there sleep and are now awakening passions of a violence exceeding ... anything among the tremendous forces that capitalism has created. Anyone who knows them, who knows their history, is able to talk to them intimately, watches them at their own theaters, watches them at their dances, watches them in their churches, reads their press with a discerning eye, must recognize that although their social force may not be able to compare with the social force of a corresponding number of organized workers, the hatred of bourgeois society and the readiness to destroy it, when the opportunity should present itself, rests among them to a degree greater than in any other section of the population of the United States." End quote. C.L.R. James. That quote is from The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the USA, 1948. And here we are, Chapter 3. Education, Propaganda, Agitation. Having decided to temporarily relocate to America to serve the movement as a Trotskyist troubleshooter, C.L.R. James went on to become a central player in the country's peripheral far left. The bulk of James's writing in this period was aimed at a relatively narrow audience, the quote, reading public, and periphery of the radical left, those who subscribed to the New International, Labor Action, or who somehow became aware of the pamphlets of James's own semi-Trotskyist faction, the Johnson Forest tendency. For over a decade, James seemed to drop altogether the notion of being a traditional type of, quote, writer or, quote, intellectual, concentrating instead on coddling and organizing a tiny radicalized minority of American workers into adopting a militant socialist perspective. The main incentive for taking this approach lay in the heroic expectations James quickly developed for his new homeland. For James, America held great promise on account of its brash people, lofty idealism, and dynamic popular culture. Independent movements of black industrial and women workers enjoyed a special vitality and would, James wagered, play a pivotal role in the creation of a, quote, new society James saw coming, a, quote, new society. James saw the coming war, World War II, as a bellwether for an even bigger conflagration between capital and labor. In Trinidad, James matured as an individual and as a writer. In London, James emerged as a political thinker and activist. As a West Indian New Yorker, James fashioned an idiosyncratic radicalism that was simultaneously Hegelian, Marxist, populist, and cultural. The importance of this period for James's intellectual and personal development cannot be overstated. One moment, got to pull up the footnotes, or the endnotes, excuse me. Where am I? Okay, footnote. I have written extensively on this period. C.L.R. James and the American Century, 1938 to 1953. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for this. It's available at academia.edu. But I'm not seeing anything for it. And also see the article C.L.R. James and the American Century in Selwyn Cudjoe and William Kane's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Intellectual Legacies. The description for this book says, C.L.R. James made important contributions in a host of fields: literature, criticism, cultural studies, political theory, history, and philosophy. One of the most astute minds of this century, James served as mentor for two generations of international intellectuals. James contributed enormously to the understanding of the colonial question, the Negro question, the Russian question, the role of dialectics in proletarian struggle, and the theory and practice of Marxism in the Americas. In addition to the Black Jacobins, James' incisive account of the Haitian Revolution of the 1790s, and notes on dialectics, James published a range of other books, including a classic work on the game of cricket and a study of Herman Melville. This collection of essays offers a variety of fresh perspectives on James's life, and writings included are reminiscences of those who knew James well and critical essays by eminent scholars. The book is the first to offer a full treatment of James's many contributions to 20th century intellectual life. Back to the text. See also the article C.L.R. James, Marxism in America, published in Research and Society, number 4, 1991, and the article C.L.R. James and the Gospel of American Modernity, published in Socialism and Democracy, volume 8, numbers 2 to 3. End footnote. As Scott McClemy has suggested, James's relocation to America, quote, marks a profound shift in the coordinates of his personal identity, end quote. New York may have been geographically closer to Port of Spain than London, but for a product of British colonial schools and Afro-Caribbean culture, the mannered English way of life would have been more familiar than the individualistic American. The United States, unlike Trinidad and Tobago or Britain, lacked a viable social democratic movement or party. Even during the Depression, the socialist left enjoyed only a marginal presence in the country's benighted political culture. American politics reflected the country's exceptional ethnic, regional, and racial cleavages and conflicts. Perhaps the most obvious point of contrast was that in spatial terms, the United States was apparently boundless and in many places almost devoid of human settlement. It therefore seemed to lack the sort of social cohesion that characterized both West Indian and English society. The weight of history would have undoubtedly seemed slighter, and a tremendous sense of possibility and indeterminacy was likely to have struck the expatriate intellectual. Footnote. See Scott McClemy's article, American Civilization and World Revolution, C.L.R. James in the United States, 1938 to 1953 and beyond, in Scott McClemy and Paul LeBlanc's edited volume, C.L.R. James and Revolutionary Marxism. Selected Writings, 1939 to 1949. The description for this book says, C.L.R. James was one of the most influential Marxists of his generation. His important contributions range from the subjects of black liberation to contemporary philosophy, and even touched on the anti-colonial potential of cricket. In this collection of hard-to-find articles and essays, James's towering intellect and engaging style touch on a diverse array of topics. Back to the text and footnote. Footnote. At the same time as McClemy has noted, quote, deep continuities connect, quote, James's British years with his American sojourn. That nexus is revolution, end quote. See McClemmy's article, American Civilization and World Revolution, page 217 to 218. As his personal letters reveal, the experience of traveling across the country and meeting ordinary Americans made a lasting impression on James. Anna Grimshaw and Keith Hart write, quote, having already escaped from the confines of a small Caribbean island, James was now freed from the claustrophobia of a decaying Europe, end quote. Footnote, see Anna Grimshaw and Keith Hart, C.L.R. James, and the, quote, struggle for happiness. Not seeing any, what's the word? Not seeing any descriptions for that online. End footnote. Grimshaw and Keith Hart go on to cite a passage from Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways where James describes, quote, my first journey from Chicago to Los Angeles by train, the apparently endless miles, hour after hour, all day and all night, and the next morning the same again until the evening. I experienced a sense of expansion which has permanently altered my attitude to the world, end quote. James, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, Herman Melville, and the World We Live In. That's actually currently published with University of Chicago Press, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, the story of Herman Melville and the world we live in. The description says, political theorist and cultural critic, novelist, and critic enthusiast C.L.R. James lived from 1901 to 1989, was a brilliant polymath who has been described by Edward Said as, quote, a centrally important 20th century figure, end quote. Through such landmark works as the Black Jacobins, Beyond a Boundary, and American Civilization, James's thought continues to influence and inspire scholars in a wide variety of fields. Quote, there is little doubt, end quote, wrote novelist Carol Phillips in The New Republic, quote, that James will come to be regarded as the outstanding Caribbean mind of the 20th century, end quote. In his seminal work of literary and cultural criticism, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, James anticipated many of the concerns and ideas that have shaped the contemporary fields of American and post-colonial studies, yet this widely influential book has been unavailable in its complete form since its original publication in 1953. A provocative study of Moby Dick in which James challenged the prevailing Americanist interpretation that opposed a, quote, totalitarian Ahab and a, quote, democratic and American Ishmael. He offered instead a vision of a factory like Piquode, whose, quote, captain of industry leads the, quote, mariners, renegades, and castaways, end quote, of its crew to their doom. In addition to demonstrating how such an interpretation supported the emerging U.S. national security state, James also related the narrative of Moby Dick and its resonance in American literary and political culture to his own persecuted position at the height or the depth of the Truman/McCarthy era. It is precisely this personal, deeply original material that was excised from the only subsequent edition. With a new introduction by Donald E. Peace that places the work in its critical and cultural context, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways is once again available in its complete form. Back to the text and footnote. This, quote, sense of expansion, end quote, was accompanied by a sense of excitement and intellectual stimulation. Living in such a buoyant and chaotic society appealed to his imagination, to his ambition, and to his anthropological curiosity. Far from being an America basher, James harbored a deep attachment to the country's popular culture, America's movies, comic strips, genre fiction, radio plays, and popular music. Even after a grueling internment on Ellis Island, at the height of the anti-communist scare, James told two of his American friends that, quote, at the present moment, the feeling that I have the memory of life, the feeling that I have and the memory of life in the United States are expressed most concretely in gramophone records, jazz records in particular, and movies, really ordinary commonplace movies, end quote. Footnote. Letter from C.L.R. James to Grace Lee and Selma Weinstein, December 14th, 1953. See Anna Grimshaw, C.L.R. James Archive, A Reader's Guide. And I've looked that up before, and I don't see any citations. Any kind of descriptions for it online. Anyway, end footnote. Partly as a result of his uncertain status as an illegal alien, James was more cloistered than before in the sense that his writings and lectures were almost exclusively aimed at the cognoscenti. At the same time, however, James's work and activities in this period displayed an uncommon openness to new ideas and new experiences. James's commitment to and understanding of socialist politics and philosophy deepened at the same time that his admiration for the world's most capitalistic nation grew. It was an unrequited love. The always cosmopolitan Trinidadian was able to make only the faintest imprint on a society that was essentially impervious to the most supple of Marxisms. New section. Quote, "It was only when I went to the United States," end quote, James later claimed, quote, "that I really became active in those issues," end quote. That is, comprehending and confronting racism. So, quoted in C.L.R. James, Morrow, edited volume Visions of History, published with Pantheon Press, 1983. The description for Visions of History says 13 historians explain how they develop their unique approaches to the study of the past and share their goals in writing history. And the people on this list are E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, Sheila Rowbotham, Linda Gordon, Natalie Zeman Davis, William Appleman Williams, Stoughton Lind, David Montgomery, Herbert Gutman, Vincent Harding, John Womack, C.L.R. James, Moshe Lewin. End footnote. As strategically critical as it no doubt was, the struggle against colonialism in the Caribbean did not necessarily invoke the same social dynamics as the struggle against racial segregation in the United States. Although James did not abandon his primary emphasis on class and class conflict, James's experience in the U.S. led him to revise more than once his conception of the dialectics of class, race, and capitalism. As a resident of the world's most populous free society, James was able to gain a first-hand sense of the intolerable conditions under which most blacks lived. For a period of time during the war, James lived on 125th Street in Harlem, and for 5 months during 1991, he assisted striking sharecroppers in southeast Missouri. While on a lecture tour for the Socialist Workers' Party in 1938, James met with members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and lunched with journalists at the black-owned Pittsburgh Courier. After the 1939 visit with Leon Trotsky in Mexico, he returned to New York City by bus from New Orleans. What appears to have struck him most was the unresolved character of race relations in America, the underlying resentment of the black population, and at the same time the need for institution building and consciousness raising among all oppressed sectors of society. James also commented in private correspondence on the, quote, feeling of uncertainty, end quote, read anxiety, that his first direct contact with the American South provoked within him. Arriving in the New Orleans harbor on a Mexican steamer, he revealed his concerns in a letter to Constance Webb, quote, there are taxis for white and taxis for blacks, and if few blacks travel by this boat, there will be no taxis for them, and I shall have to telephone for one. So that is my introduction to the South. People have been warning me, and I said, quote, oh, I'll manage. Perhaps with too much confidence. If I were an American citizen, I wouldn't care, but if I get into any trouble with the police, bang go my hopes for a further extension of my visa and re-entry after a little trip abroad. Strange, as I near the actual contact I begin to feel a slight nervousness. I shall get through, of course, unless someone goes out of his way to annoy me, but the feeling of uncertainty shows me how terribly the minds and characters of Negroes must be affected, especially those with no experience or political or historical background to help them, or no consciousness of a way out." End quote. Footnote: Letter from C.L.R. James to Constance Webb, 1939. As someone End footnote. As someone who had the requisite Marxist training, James was already familiar with the history of black nationalist movements that had flourished in the early years of the 20th century. He knew, for example, about how radical veterans had organized a revolutionary nationalist organization, the African Blood Brotherhood, in the years following the end of World War I. The Brotherhood's newspaper, The Crusader, publicized the organization's armed defense of Tulsa's embattled black community during the race riots of 1920. Is African Blood Brotherhood, is that the Garvey organization? I'm not sure. The African Blood Brotherhood for African Liberation and Redemption, ABB, was a U.S. black liberation organization established in 1919 in New York City by journalist Cyril Biggs. The group was established as a propaganda organization built on the model of the secret society. The African Blood Brotherhood for African Liberation and Redemption's socialist orientation caught the attention of the fledgling American Communist movement, and the African Blood Brotherhood soon evolved into a propaganda arm of the Communist Party of America. The group was terminated in the early 1920s. Back to the text. Although James may not have met ex-Brotherhood activists, James did speak with former members of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, an organization whose avowed aim was the establishment of a, quote, universal confederacy among the race, to promote race pride and to administer to and assist the needy, end quote. Footnote: cited in Tony Bogus and Kim Gordon's Black Nationalism and Socialism, published in London, 1979. I'm not seeing any descriptions of this book. Back to the text. End footnote. Garvey, a Jamaican-born journalist and orator, built a Pan-African organization which, by the mid-1920s, boasted of having over 1,000 branches on 5 continents. James was later to write that Marcus Garvey made, quote, the Negro people and the people of Africa an integral part of world history, where they have remained ever since, end quote. It was the, quote, greatest propaganda feat of the 20th century, end quote. The very existence of an African Blood Brotherhood or the United Negro Improvement Association suggested that in one form or another black nationalism was a constant factor in African American politics. It was as a U.S. resident that James became cognizant of this fact. He also became aware of the ambiguous legacy of the left's position on the, quote, race question. He knew, for example, that Eugene Debs, the charismatic leader of the pre-World War I Socialist Party, insisted more than once that, quote, we have nothing special to offer the Negro worker, end quote. Footnote: cited in Tony Bogus, Marxism and Black Liberation, published in 1980. Yeah, not seeing any descriptions of that book. End footnote. In a similar vein, the journalist John Reed told Comintern officials in 1920 that, quote, the Negroes do not pose the demand for national independence. A movement which aims for a separate national existence, like for instance the Back to Africa movement that could be observed a few years ago, is never successful among the Negroes, end quote. Bogus, or Bogues, Bogues, Marxism and Black Liberation, page 32. What Debs and Reed were reluctant to admit was that nationalistic slogans such as the calls for repatriation or autonomous homelands were rooted in both symbolism and a material desire for political and social equality. Quote, back to Africa, end quote, was a metaphor as well as a program, a set of images as well as an agenda. Working class unity, the traditional mantra of the American left, was no substitute for a historically grounded conception of the specific dynamics of black oppression and black politics. Under Trotsky's and James's prodding, the Socialist Workers' Party began to seek opportunities to intervene among black workers and intellectuals. The Socialist Workers' Party had already achieved some success in the areas of union politics and New York intellectual life. Footnote. On the Socialist Workers' Party in the 1930s to 1940s, see Robert J. Alexander's International Trotskyism, 1929 to 1985, a documented analysis of the movement, and James P. Cannon's The History of American Trotskyism, and Alan M. Wald, The New York Intellectuals, The Rise and Decline of the Anti-Stalinist Left from the 1930s to the 1980s. I have some pieces from Robert J. Alexander's book here on this channel. In 1930, end footnote. In 1938, the party had nearly 1,000 adult members and several hundred supporters in the Young People's Socialist League. The party was able to attract thousands of people to hear the author of the Black Jacobins speak on the topic of the British Empire. Martin Glaberman remembered the tour's first stop as a resounding success. Quote, he was an honored visitor, a fabulous speaker, ... I remember the first time I ever saw James. It was a lecture at a hotel ballroom in New York where he spoke for about 3 hours on the British Empire, walking back and forth across the stage without notes or anything else, end quote. Footnote, author's interview with Martin Glaberman, May 31st, 1981. Frank Lovell, a longtime Socialist Workers' Party member, wrote that James was, quote, an impressive speaker with his British accent and his poise. It was as if he were a great actor delivering a famous oration, end quote. Footnote. Frank Lovell in James P. Cannon as We Knew Him, published with Pathfinder Press in 1976. Phyllis and Julius Jacobson recall, quote, a very striking figure, end quote, with, quote, a most magnetic handsomeness, end quote. They describe James's 1938 lecture as a, quote, spellbinding experience, end quote. Author's interview with Julius and Phyllis Jacobson, New York, November 22nd, 1992. James P. Cannon as We Knew Him by Gene Tussey, Harry Braverman, Farrell Dobbs, George Novak. The description of it says, a unique personal account of a lifelong rebel by people who knew and worked with him. Back to the text and footnote. Socialist Appeal, the party's weekly paper, boasted that, quote, scores of New York Negroes turned out to listen to one of the outstanding lecturers of their race, end quote. Footnote. British Empire speech, published Socialist Appeal, December 10th, 1938. Constance Webb, who heard James speak in Los Angeles when she was a teenager, was as dazzled as anyone, quote, James was over 6'2", slim but not thin, with long legs. He walked easily and his shoulders level. His head appeared to be on a stalk, held high with the chin tilted forward and up, which made it seem that his body was led by a long neck, curved forward like that of a racehorse on a slip. Shoulders, chest, and legs were powerful, and he moved decisively. But as with highly trained athletes, the tension was concentrated and tuned, so that he gave the impression of enormous ease. He was without self-consciousness, simply himself, which showed in the way he moved, and one recognized a special quality. End quote. Constance Webb. Footnote. Constance Webb, C.L.R. James, the Speaker and His Charisma, published in Paul Bowles' edited volume, C.L.R. James, His Life and Work. End footnote. The tour gave this remarkable specimen a first-hand impression of the American comrades in action. Although he was impressed with the youth and determination of those he met, he found the party deficient in terms of its understanding of the, quote, Negro question. In a private letter, James wrote, quote, I am now certain that no one in America, none in the party, has ever seen the Negro question for the gigantic thing it is, and will increasingly be. Leon Trotsky sees it. I was groping towards it. I begin to see it now, every day more clearly. The American Negroes touch on the one side of the American proletariat, on whom so much depends in the present period. On the other, they and not the British or French proletariat. On the other, they and not the British or French proletariat form the link with the African Revolution, and they can form a link with the millions of Indians and Negroes and half-castes who form so much of the population of Spanish America. End quote. James. Letter from C.L.R. James to Constance Webb, 1939. End footnote. Trotsky was to readily assent to James' essentially negative characterization of the party's Negro work when they spent several days together in Coyoacan, Mexico in 1939. In his preliminary remarks, Trotsky said he believed that, quote, the first question is the attitude of the Socialist Workers' Party towards the Negroes, ... The characteristic thing about American workers' organizations is their aristocratic character. It is the basis of opportunism. The skilled workers who feel set in the capitalist society held the bourgeois class to hold the Negroes and unskilled workers down to a very low scale, ... Under this condition, our party cannot develop, it will degenerate, end quote. Footnote. Leon Trotsky on Black Nationalism and Self-Determination, published with New York Pathfinder Press. Shit. The description for this book says, drawing on the rich lessons of October 1917, Trotsky explains why uncompromising opposition to racial discrimination and support for the right to national self-determination for blacks are essential to unite the working class to make a socialist revolution in the United States. Back to the text and footnote. In order to properly orient the party around this question, James made several suggestions, drawing up a program of internal education. James proposed that party members familiarize themselves with black history and culture. He was particularly interested in the work that the communists had undertaken inside the black community, and he recommended that the party members become familiar with the research that communist historians had done on slavery and the abolition movement. Footnote. He undertook some of the work himself in the late 1940s. See the two parts of Stalinism and Negro history, reprinted in McClemey and LeBlanc's edited volume, C.L.R. James and Revolutionary Marxism. End footnote. The key point he wanted to get across was that the Trotskyist movement would have to concentrate more resources on the Negro question. After all, the black masses would play a critical role in the construction of a revolutionary alternative. As he outlined in a paper written for the Coyoacan meeting, A. The Negro represents potentially the most revolutionary section of the population. B. He is ready to respond to militant leadership. C. He will respond to political situations abroad which concern him. D. He is today more militant than ever. Footnote. C.L.R. James Preliminary Notes, available at Houghton Library in some archive. End footnote. To bring large numbers of blacks into the party's orbit, James urged that the Socialist Workers' Party take the lead in establishing an independent, all-black organization that would fight for civil rights. Blacks, quote, have followed similar movements in the past, end quote, are looking for a similar movement now, end quote, he argues. A new organization, quote, has the possibility of setting the Negro masses in motion, end quote. Footnote, James, Preliminary Notes, end footnote. Through persistent activity around basic democratic and humanitarian demands, the right to vote, the integration of jobs, union schools and stores and so on, such an organization could transform the political landscape. Its formation would be also heat up the class struggle and bring credit to the Socialist Workers' Party, which would eschew a vanguard role in favor of a strategic alliance with a mass movement. To my understanding, that's not the ambition of black nationalism at all. Black nationalism is not in favor of integration of jobs, unions, schools, and stores. What they're in favor of is creating an autonomous, separate society of some kind, in a territorial society based on black control of political, economic, and social life in a given territory. Something comparable to, perhaps comparable to certain interpretations of Zionism. If you listen to the speech by Malcolm X called "Message to the Grassroots," this is later, so it's like, and it's Malcolm X. He's only one particular voice, I'm sure, in this overall movement. But he mocked basically the civil rights movement and its integrationist approach, saying, "Oh yeah, you're doing all this struggle just so you can take a shit next to a white man in the same bathroom." Kind of very, very dismissive of this whole approach of integration of jobs and shit like that. I feel like there's definitely a tendency, and this is just a personal opinion, and maybe you'll call me a racist or something like that, but there does seem to be a tendency amongst leftists to whitewash some of these darker, more hateful moments of black nationalism. That's just like a thought to me. He's talking about, if you listen to "Message to the Grassroots," it's very much an extremely hateful speech, and basically thinks that when the Black Revolution happens, they should kill all the Uncle Toms who want to integrate American society as opposed to create their own black nation. Obviously, Malcolm X is a bit of a moving target. He says different things at different times, and his life was cut short by the Muslim Brotherhood, not the Muslim Brotherhood, excuse me, Nation of Islam. But what he could have said is, we don't know. But there's definitely very unsavory moments that he's of his work that were available in the early 60s. I think he was assassinated in 1965. Not exactly sure of the date, but one of the things that what was I gonna say? There's another thing that was in my thought. Is that his politics? There's kind of this idea that and I'm not sure. I mean, who knows how far it would have changed, but he was only out of the Nation of Islam for a very short time. I don't even think it might not have even been a year. It might have been a year and a half. So make this kind of thing where it's oh, this is what Malcolm X thought at this time, and then at the end of it, he didn't think that. That's wild. I mean, I don't know. That doesn't seem correct. Most of his work, and when he became famous, he was saying extremely hateful shit. And just because it came from the voice of the oppressed doesn't mean that its ultimate end game is emancipatory. Anyway, back to the text. End footnote. Oh, wait, no, not end footnote. I didn't say footnote. What was the last sentence I read? Through persistent activity around basic democratic and humanitarian demands, the right to vote, the integration of jobs, unions, schools, and stores, and so on, such an organization could transform the American political landscape. Its formation would also heat up the class struggle and bring credit to the Socialist Workers' Party, which would eschew a vanguard role in favor of a strategic alliance with a mass movement. It should be noted that the Socialist Workers' Party and its predecessors had never quite undertaken a project of this type before. In common with other small parties founded on Leninist principles, the Socialist Workers' Party had established various, quote, front groups and had collaborated with non-party forces around specific issues, such as strike support and anti-fascist mobilization. But James is proposing that the party should commit its resources to a long-term strategy where few immediate gains were likely. The point of such an exercise would be to facilitate the autonomous self-activity of the most militant section of the community, not to simply recruit more members into the Socialist Workers' Party. It was a, quote, transitional program of another kind. To his credit, Trotsky agreed that the party's policy could not involve, quote, simply passing through for a few weeks. It is a question of awakening the Negro masses, ... End quote. Trotsky on footnote. Leon Trotsky on Black Nationalism and Self-Determination, page 55. Far from being opposed to James's program, Trotsky was intrigued by the prospect of party members taking a bold initiative in this area. At the same time, he raised the practical matter of whether the Socialist Workers' Party itself had the human resources to launch such a movement. Quote, the question remains, end quote, he noted, quote, as to whether we can take upon ourselves the initiative of forming such an organization of Negroes for Negroes, not for the purpose of winning some elements to our party, but for the purpose of doing systematic educational work in order to elevate them politically, end quote. Trotsky. The war and a 1940 split inside the Socialist Workers' Party derailed any specific plans, but the Trotsky-James discussions had a salutary effect on the movement's appreciation for the need to develop a specific approach to black politics. The party's press began to cover issues of particular concern to African Americans, partly through James's own column titled The Negro Question. A Negro department was set up and the party's political program was revised in accordance to the agenda discussed in Koyoakan. The fact that the Socialist Workers' Party later sought to find common ground with Malcolm X in the early 1960s reflected Trotsky's sympathetic attitude toward black nationalism and his efforts to prod the party into action around the question of racism and white supremacy. Socialist Workers' Party leader George Brightman played a particularly critical role in developing and clarifying the party's position among the lines suggested by the Trotsky-James dialogue. Footnote. In the 1960s and 1970s, Brightman edited several volumes of Malcolm X's speeches for Pathfinder Press that sold and continued to sell in enormous quantities. A useful overview of the party's position is contained in Evelyn Sell's How the Concept of the Dual Nature of the African American Struggle Developed, published in the Bulletin in Defense of Marxism, Volume 10, Number 10, December 1992. Whether or not you could say that the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States was anything remotely resembling a traditional Trotskyist party by that point is questionable. The Socialist Workers' Party adopted like a very pro-Cuba and Fidelista line in the early 1980s, I believe. I think that was the date. I know that happened, but I'm not sure if I got the date right. But back to the text. End footnote. Yet James brought an unorthodox perspective on the role of socialists in the struggle for African American liberation. Trotsky unknowingly lent his imprimatur to a policy which would open the door to a sweeping assault on the Leninist theory of the vanguard party. As the transcript reveals, Trotsky and James conducted an animated and friendly series of exchanges. Although their conversations focused on black politics, James and Trotsky also discussed the latter's criticisms of World Revolution 1917 to 1936 and the prospects for the fledgling Fourth International. However, the transcript of their conversation gives little indication of James' impending break with Trotskyism. Even a year after their meeting, James eulogized Trotsky in the following terms, quote, "To appreciate Trotsky's powers and Trotsky's past, the enormous force of this many-sided and yet perfectly integrated personality, and to see him listening patiently to some inexperienced comrade putting forward his inexperienced ideas, to read letters in which he took up some apparently minor point and elaborated it, meeting all possible objections one by one, was to have a great lesson in the difference between the superficial arrogance which often characterizes essentially sensitive men, and the ocean of strength, patience, and resilience which can come from complete devotion to a cause." End quote. Footnote: C.L.R. James, Trotsky's Place in History, published 1940. Available in McClemay and LeBlanc's C.L.R. James and Revolutionary Marxism. However consistent with the viewpoint expressed in World Revolution, this tone was hardly in keeping with what would become a pronounced antipathy to Trotsky's political method and legacy. This more critical perspective emerged in the early 1940s in the context of the collaborative work James undertook in developing an independent Marxist conception of social emancipation. James was later to claim that, quote, "Trotsky, who had isolated himself from Lenin's concrete struggle, made no contribution to the struggle for international socialism. On every serious point, Trotsky was wrong." End quote. James. Notes on Dialectics, Hegel, Marx, Lenin. In another context, James conceded that, quote, "Trotsky understood as few men have ever done the creative power of the proletariat in revolution," end quote, but went on to observe that, quote, "the full and complete significance of the creative power of the proletariat in the construction of the socialist economy always eluded him," end quote. For a very, very important piece about C.L.R. James's kind of whitewashed, historically uncomprehending, historically flawed interpretation of Lenin. Check out the piece by Matthew Quest that's available on this channel. Very, very important piece. Footnote: C.L.R. James, after 10 years, reprinted in C.L.R. James' Spheres of Existence Selected Writings. End footnote. As we have seen, this was not James's attitude in 1939. There's every indication that during their conversations in Mexico, James was attentive to the nuances of Trotsky's analysis, but his objections to specific aspects of Trotsky's polemics would soon become apparent. Returning to New York, James began writing for Socialist Appeal and the Socialist Workers' Party's theoretical journal, New International, a monthly organ of revolutionary Marxism, end quote. James's articles played a significant role in articulating the party's opposition to the war, which James regarded as an inter-imperialist quarrel over the contours of political power in the second half of the 20th century. Neither the Allies nor the Axis powers were fighting for the liberation of industrial workers or third world peoples. Quote, "Democracy," James averred, quote, "has nothing to do with this war," end quote, and nothing good would come out of it. Quote, "A worldwide crisis, 30 million unemployed, fascism and imperialist war, that is what the capitalists have to offer. They must be broken, and only the workers' revolution can break them," end quote. James. Footnote: J.R. Johnson, Labor and the Second World War, Socialist Appeal, November 21st, 1939. Several of James's anti-war articles are reprinted in Fred Stanton's edited volume, Fighting Racism in World War II. Um, this edited volume, Fighting Racism in World War II, this is why it's important to have the full title, because it's made it sound like it was just random miscellaneous people talking about racism in World War II. But this is from the pages of The Militant. The full title of this book, Fighting Racism in World War II, from the pages of The Militant, is edited by Cyril Lionel Robert James, CLR James, George Brightman, and Ed Keemer, published with Pathfinder in 1980. And the description says, a week-by-week account from 1939 to 1945 of efforts to advance the black rights struggle in face of patriotic appeals to postpone resistance to lynch mob terror and racist discrimination until after the U.S.'s victory in World War II. These struggles of a peace with rising anti-imperialist battles in Africa, Asia, and the Americas helped lay the basis for the mass civil rights movement in the post-war decades. Back to the text and footnote. The Trotskyist position was one of, quote, revolutionary defeatism, end quote, a call for soldiers, sailors, and workers to turn their weapons against the bourgeoisie of all countries. As appalling as Hitler and the Nazis were, their kind could only be defeated through a European-wide uprising, quote, from below, end quote. Implicated in the evils of colonialism, racial segregation, and capitalist exploitation, the Allied powers could not be expected to carry out the sweeping changes needed to wipe out the scourge of fascism. The role of the Trotskyists would be to link the war against fascism to the struggle against capitalism. The Socialist Workers' Party's ability to implement a policy of revolutionary defeatism was severely handicapped by a damaging internal faction fight that led to the formation of a rival Trotskyist group, the Workers' Party, in 1940. The chief issue at stake concerned the class character of the Soviet Union and the appropriate attitude that revolutionaries were supposed to adopt towards the world's only self-proclaimed, quote, worker state, end quote. The appellation worker state was not something that the Soviet Union only called itself. Trotsky called it a worker state. It wasn't just, he thought that it substantially was a worker state. This kind of like putting worker state in quotes as if it was just like the opinion of the Soviet Union and not its ostensible left-wing opposition represented by Trotskyism, as if it wasn't like that, as if it wasn't Trotskyism's also what also what Trotskyism called the Soviet Union. While Trotsky urged Fourth Internationalists to offer a resolute, quote, defense of the Soviet Union, not for its internal policies, but in the event that the USSR was attacked by the capitalist states, many of his followers were leery of lending any support to the communist camp. In fact, that's the kind of a misrepresentation as well, because it was about its internal policies. It was about what was like people try to. I feel like a lot of times you see this kind of separation between like defense of the USSR and whether or not it's a worker state. They're two separate questions, but I think they're pretty integrally related. If you're very much convinced that the Soviet Union is a worker state in some capacity, then the question of its defense seems pretty obvious. But if you think that what the USSR has lost any kind of claim to being called a worker state under Stalin, with the mass terror and exploitation that was happening there on the basis of nationalized property, that fundamentally changes whether you think it's a defensible institution or not, whether you think the USSR is reactionary. Indeed, it seems like a lot of times with Trotsky, it seems like what they find the most reactionary about the Soviet Union is its international policy, which was cautious. For instance, not supporting the revolutionaries in Spain, in fact, sabotaging the revolution. Whereas what it was doing inside itself was, in some sense progressive, extending the planning, holding on to the monopoly of foreign trade, holding on to nationalized property. It wasn't just maybe it's, of course, defending the Soviet Union in principle, not for its like, it's like, maybe it's not, they were critical of this or that policy, just like anyone who supports the defense of a state doesn't favor all of its policies. But they thought about it, they thought it was defensible in a fundamental way. In fact, differences over, quote, the Russian question, end quote, have been simmering for several decades, as had personal tensions between party leaders James Buchanan and Max Shachtman. However, Cannon had managed to maintain an acceptable level of party discipline throughout the 1930s by appealing to Trotsky's personal authority and by building up a cadre of militants who were steadfastly loyal to the party regime. Cannon's efficient but sometimes heavy-handed leadership style quickly became a central issue in the faction fight. A more conciliatory approach on Cannon's part might have prevented a profound rupture in what was at the time the world's largest Trotskyist formation. Yet Cannon and Trotsky were united in their belief that it was critical that the party hold fast to its, quote, orthodox, end quote, position on the Russian question. One of the things that I think is important to note is that it's a very this kind of like this very like Stalinistic kind of like focus on like discipline and like subordination to the party center that is that many Trotskyist organizations, or at least to my understanding, at least the Socialist Workers' Party, was something that James Buchanan learned from the Zinovievist Bolshevization policies internationally. That James Buchanan learned his conception of the party from Bolshevization, which is something that the Third Campus kind of like, despite obviously being in a united party with him, the Third Campus after the 1939-40 split, like look back to and say, this is where James Buchanan's like conception of the party comes from. It's a Zinovievist conception of the party. And some people argue, and I think that they think that this is like Trotsky's, also where Trotsky gets his conception of the party. I think is Ernest Haverkern says something to that effect in one of his articles, but that's just one guy. Maybe that's incorrect. Back to the text. The emergence of an anti-Cannon faction inside the Socialist Workers' Party was more or less given once the events in the real world ensured that ideological cracks within the party could no longer be papered over. Specifically, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which Trotsky had predicted, and the Soviet invasion of Finland of 1939 seemed to undermine Trotsky's view that the Soviet Union was a progressive historical force vis-a-vis liberal capitalism. Led by a triumvirate with deep roots in the radical movement, Max Shachtman, a noted orator, James Burnham, professor of philosophy at New York University, and Martin Aburn, a longtime party officer, the Socialist Workers' Party minority argued that the USSR could no longer be characterized, as Trotsky maintained, as a, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote, although James was initially critical of both factions on the grounds that a split would be, quote, irresponsible, end quote. Footnote. In a letter to Constance Webb dated September 4th, 1939, James wrote, quote, but to date the majority, led by James Cannon, says of the minority, quote, irresponsible, jittery, and unprincipled, subject to social patriotic pressure, end quote. The minority says of the majority, quote, Stalinist, bureaucratic, and unable to lead the party, end quote. A split on such issues would show the utmost irresponsibility on both sides, end quote. James changed his mind, I think, because the faction around Shackleton was younger, more dynamic, and genuinely interested in ideas, and because a split was inevitable. But he remained critical of the leadership of both factions in The Roots of the Party Crisis, which circulated inside the Socialist Workers' Party in 1939. James complained that the, quote, upper crust of the leadership, both majority and minority, is rotten with those intellectual vices once described by Lenin, quote, lackadaisicalness, carelessness, slovenliness, untidiness, nervous haste, the inclination to substitute discussion for action, talk for work, end quote. Lenin. Excuse me, James. I thought that was a quote by Lenin, James quoting Lenin, but no, that's a quote by James. Sorry. Although James was initially critical of both factions on the grounds that a split would be, quote, irresponsible, James soon sided with the Shackleton minority and traveled to Los Angeles, quote, to present the minority viewpoint to the Western comrades, end quote. Footnote. Constance Ashton Myers, The Prophet's Army, Trotskyist in America, 1928 to 1941. I actually have the chapter that's on the split from that book on this channel. Cannon consequently sent an epistle to Socialist Workers' Party branches in California, quote, I hear that Johnson, the disorganizer, is going to lead a discussion of the Los Angeles comrades on the organization question. This imprudence can only be based on the assumption that any kind of quackery can prosper in Southern California. But I know another California, the California of a group of resolute Trotskyists, ... end quote. James P. Cannon, Struggle for a Proletarian Party. Published with Pathfinder Press, probably, I guess, republished with Pathfinder Press in 1972. End footnote. It was during this period that James began working with Raya Dunayevskaya, a dedicated and brilliant Russian-born intellectual who had served as a translator and personal secretary to Trotsky and who encouraged James to stay in the United States and work on developing a state capitalist perspective on the Soviet Union and an independent perspective on revolutionary strategy. While many of the party's trade union cadre sided with Cannon, most of the younger members joined the minority camp. The minority was particularly successful in attracting a sizable number of young Jews who were in and around the milieu of the so-called New York intellectuals. Footnote. As evidenced by the large crop of memoirs and studies that have appeared in recent years, there is considerable interest in the activities and writings of the New York intellectuals. See inter alia Alexander Bloom, Prodigal Sons, the New York Intellectuals and Their World, published with Oxford University Press in 1986. The description of this book says... The description of Prodigal Sons, the New York Intellectuals and Their World by Alexander Bloom says, quote, from Lionel Trilling to Irving Kristol, from Philip Rauh to Norman Podhoretz, this book offers a comprehensive look at New York intellectual life over the past half-century. Bloom traces the rise of the New York intellectuals from their origins, poor, Jewish, the children of immigrants, to their coming to prominence in our intellectual establishment. It takes us through nearly all the crucial intellectual and political events of the last decade and behind the scenes at such important journals as Partisan Review, Commentary, and The Public Interest. So that's Prodigal Sons, the New York Intellectuals and Their World by Alexander Bloom. Next book, Terry A. Cooney, The Rise of the New York Intellectuals, Partisan Review and Its Circle, 1934 to 1945. The description for the book, The Rise of the New York Intellectuals, Partisan Review and Its Circle, 1934 to 45, by Terry A. Cooney, says, Terry A. Cooney traces the evolution of the Partisan Review, often considered to be the most influential little magazine ever published in America during its formative years, giving a lucid and dispassionate view of the magazine and its luminaries who played a leading role in shaping the public discourse of American intellectuals. Included are Lionel Trilling, Philip Roth, William Phillips, Dwight MacDonald, F.W. Dupee, Mary McCarthy, Sidney Hook, Harold Rosenberg, and Delmore Schwartz, among others. And there's a blurb below that says, quote, "An excellent book which works at each level on which it operates. It succeeds a straightforward narrative account of the Partisan Review in the 1930s and 1940s. The magazine's leading voices, William Phillips, Philip Roth, Dwight MacDonald, Lionel Trilling, and all the rest, received their due. Among the themes that engage Cooney are how they dealt with, quote, modernism in culture and radicalism in politics, each on its own and in combination, how Jewishness played a complex and fascinating role in many of the thinkers' lives, and especially how, quote, cosmopolitanism, end quote, best explains what the Partisan Review was all about." So that was the description of Terry A. Cooney, The Rise of the New York Intellectuals, Partisan Review and its Circle, 1934 to 1945. Irving Howe, A Margin of Hope, an Intellectual Autobiography. The description for this book says, A Margin of Hope, an Intellectual Autobiography, published in 1984. Irving Howe says, a leading literary critic and the author of World of Our Fathers, looks back on his life from the early 1930s to the 1970s, a perceptive account of Howe's intellectual growth. Back to the text. Richard H. Pell's The Liberal Mind in a Conservative Age, American Intellectuals in the 1940s and 1950s. I'm not seeing any description for The Liberal Mind in a Conservative Age, American Intellectuals in the 1940s and 1950s by Richard H. Pells. And finally, Alan Wall, The New York Intellectuals, The Rise and Decline of the Anti-Stalinist Left from the 1930s to the 1980s. I'm not going to look that up because that book's like mad well known, especially in the radical left milieu. Compelled to devise a positive alternative, end footnote. Compelled to devise a positive alternative to the orthodox Trotskyist position, which he had developed strong doubts about by 1937 to 1938, Shachtman helped to clarify the theory of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, which described the Soviet Union as an anti-democratic regime of a new type, neither capitalist nor socialist. The two sides could now be clearly differentiated on the basis of their incompatible perspectives on the Russian question. I believe that Shachtman was more of a doubter than a full-on critic who put forward his own conception of what the USSR fundamentally was in the late 1930s. He definitely comes to subscribe to He definitely comes to subscribe to the bureaucratic collectivist thesis eventually, but not for some time. It took a little while. Furthermore, all sides believed that it was vital that a revolutionary organization maintain a proper attitude with regards to this question. This consensus made a split of some kind almost inevitable. Buchanan insisted that the main issue was not the minority faction's hastily formulated position on the USSR, but was that faction's dubious class character, specifically its roots in the urban middle strata with weak links to the proletariat. He warned that, quote, with the approach of war, Trotskyism as a doctrine and as a movement began to lose its, quote, respectability, end quote, and emphasized the fact that, quote, our party membership consists in part of petty bourgeois elements completely disconnected from the proletarian class struggle, ... end quote. Cannon, Struggle for a Proletarian Party, page 6. This effectively reduced the split to a question of objective class relations, but of course Cannon's implicit identification of the, quote, proletarian class struggle, end quote, with the Socialist Workers' Party majority was nothing more than a tired conceit. Cannon seemed to acknowledge no role for honest intellectual debate in the sphere of revolutionary politics. The uncompromising Trotskyist leader was right, however, to suggest that the coming war would drastically alter the political climate in America. Despite the Constitution's First Amendment, 18 Socialist Workers' Party leaders, including Cannon, would be imprisoned in 1944 under the Smith Act for their anti-war stance. The Communist Party enthusiastically gave its blessing to this and other government clampdowns on wartime dissent. Motivated by a desire to build a, quote, small mass party that could ultimately replace the Communist Party as the main force on the left, hundreds of, quote, petty bourgeois members of the new, quote, Shachtmanite organization took blue-collar jobs during World War II. Their strategy, known as, quote, proletarianization, was to place their cadre in the core sectors of the economy, especially where the methods of production had collected together the largest concentrations of workers, such as shipyards, auto plants, steel mills, and so on. Footnote: the definitive account of the internal life of the Workers' Party and the impact of proletarianization on the party members is Harry Swato's novel Standing Fast. The description for Harvey Swatos's Standing Fast on Goodreads says, a masterful novel of political progressives making their way and not in an ever-changing post-war America. For Marty Dworkin and his band of young Trotskyist dreamers in Buffalo, New York, the vision of a just socialist world crumbles with the rise of Stalin and the chaos of World War II. In the 2 decades that follow, Dworkin and his idealistic colleagues strive to establish a new political party and battle through unexpected trials with family, work, aging in the changing world. They run up against an increasingly conservative America and a thriving materialism directly opposed to their own fervent beliefs. They emerge humbled but still hopeful into the 1960s, when civil rights struggles and anti-war radicalism moved to center stage. Standing Fast is a classic panoramic portrait of life amid the shattered dreams and visionary ambitions of the American left. Sounds interesting. Back to the text and footnote. Shachtman's Workers' Party had been formally inaugurated in April 1940 at a conference attended by some 800 people. Walking out of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Shachtman-Burnham-Aburn minority ended up taking nearly half the organization with them. At the party's first convention, it was agreed that the Workers' Party would constitute the foundation of a new revolutionary socialist party, one that was internally democratic, principled in its opposition to the war, and equally critical of Western capitalism and Soviet bureaucratic collectivism. The new neo-Trotskyist organization attracted a throng of intellectuals and writers who had been previously in the orbit of the Socialist Workers' Party, such as Saul Bellow, Hal Draper, James T. Farrell, Irving Howe, and B.J. Wittig. Draper, Howe, and Wittig were all active in the new organization. For a short period, Dwight MacDonald, the essayist and editor of Partisan Review, lent his support to the Workers' Party after having become disillusioned with the small-mindedness that characterized the orthodox Trotskyists. Quote, I must confess I often felt like Alice. Comrade Cannon has some resemblance to the caterpillar Alice found sitting on a mushroom serenely smoking a hookah. Are you now content? Said the caterpillar. Well, I should like to be a little larger, sir, if you wouldn't mind, said Alice. 3 inches is just such a wretched height to be. It is a very good height indeed, said the caterpillar angrily, rearing itself upright as it spoke. It was exactly 3 inches high. End quote. Dwight MacDonald. Footnote. Dwight MacDonald, Memoirs of a Revolutionist, page 276. Yeah, that's not a good good description of Memoirs of a Revolutionist, Essays in Political Criticism by Dwight MacDonald. End footnote. Back to the text. James was far more committed to the utopia of a communist revolution than either Burnham or MacDonald, whom he dismissed as, quote, counter-revolutionary, as a, quote, counter-revolutionary songbird, end quote. Indeed, James disdained all but the youngest and most radical of the Workers' Party intellectuals and effectively turned his back on the world of partisan review and the New York intellectuals. Characterized by an attachment to Freudian analysis, a fundamentally liberal left sensibility, and an even deepening connection to the literary establishment, this celebrated subculture seemed to have left him cold. James maintained friendly relations with a handful of individuals such as Meyer Shapiro, the erudite Marxist art critic, but his relationship with others, particularly the pugnacious Irving Howe, deteriorated over time as political differences became transformed into personal animosities. Wikipedia says Meyer Shapiro lived from 1904 to 1996 and was a Lithuanian-born American art historian who developed new art historical methodologies that incorporated an interdisciplinary approach to the study of works. An expert on early Christian, medieval, and modern art, he explored periods and movements with an eye toward their work's social, political, and material construction, credited with fundamentally changing the course of the art historical discipline. Shapiro's scholarly approach was dynamic and it engaged other scholars, philosophers, and artists. An active professor, lecturer, student, writer, and humanist, Meyer Shapiro maintained a long professional association with Columbia University in New York. Back to the text. With regard to some of the less self-conscious political members of the partisan review, such as the poet Delmore Schwartz, James seemed largely indifferent. Footnote. Delmore Schwartz makes reference in his diary to meeting James at a party at Dwight MacDonald's in 1939. See Elizabeth Pillette, edited volume Portrait of Delmore, Journals and Notes of Delmore Schwartz, 1939 to 1959. Scott McLemmie deserves credit for digging up this and other similarly intriguing sources. I can't remember what album it is. I think it might be, what the hell is the Blue Mask? I think it might be called. But it's a Lou Reed album. And he has a song about, like, being haunted by the ghost of Delmore Schwartz, who was, like, his, I think Lou Reed's, like mentor or, like, professor or something at some point in his life. And the description of Portrait of Delmore, Journals and Notes of Delmore Schwartz, 1939 to 1959, says, the papers of Delmore Schwartz were fortuitously located through a barroom conversation that led to their rescue by Dwight MacDonald several years after the poet's death in 1966. These journals and notes, now at Yale, provide a brilliant self-portrait of the poet, showing his creative genius at work. Back to the text and footnote. James's evident preference was to collaborate with the theoretician Raya Dunayevskaya, auto worker Martin Glaberman, and a small number of others eschewing the intelligentsia's, quote, little magazines and also mass-market publications. He concentrated on generating articles for the Trotskyist press as a way of circulating his ideas. After James's visa ran out, James was forced to go underground and was effectively barred from speaking at public gatherings. One of the very last public addresses was delivered for the Workers' Party in the winter of 1940, shortly after France had been overrun by the Nazis. It appeared that Germany would soon control all of Europe, and despite the Workers' Party's anti-war perspective, party members were of course horrified at the spectacle of a European fascist juggernaut. Conrad Lynn, a black lawyer who was later active in the civil rights movement, remembered this talk vividly many years later. Quote, C.L.R. James was the only speaker, and he was magnificent. His address lasted 75 minutes, and he seemed equally at home in English, Yiddish exclamation point, and French. Never had I witnessed such a performance. James proved, despite all appearances, Hitler could not win. The meeting unanimously delegated to James the authority to write the entire next issue of New International. It was entitled Capitalist Society and the War, and it must be a bibliophile's prize now. End quote. Conrad Lynn. Wikipedia says Conrad Lynn lived from 1908 to 1995 and was an African-American civil rights lawyer and activist known for providing legal representation for activists, including many unpopular defendants. Among the causes he supported as a lawyer were civil rights, Puerto Rican nationalism, and opposition to the draft during both World War II and the Vietnam War. Controversial defendants he represented including civil rights activist Robert F. Williams and Black Panther leader H. Rap Brown. Back to the text. Footnote. Conrad Lynn, There is a Fountain. The description for this book says, there's a typo in the description. It says now lawyer, but it's clearly no lawyer. No lawyer since Clarence Darrow has had such a colorful career and successfully defended so many controversial cases as Conrad Lynn, whose autobiography spans 60 years of legal and political struggle for equality and justice for the disenfranchised. Quote, the Clarence Darrows, the the Andrew Hamiltons, the Leonard Boudins, and of course the Conrad Lynns, have managed to keep alive freedom's most cherished ideals, end quote. William M. Kunstler from the foreword. Back to the text and footnote. Another bibliophile's prize is titled My Friends, A Fireside Chat on the War by Native Son, which the Workers' Party issued in June 1940 and which sold for a penny. The author's alias, one of James's more obscure pseudonyms, was taken from Richard Wright's novel Native Son, while the title makes reference to President Roosevelt's famous broadcast speeches. Wikipedia says Richard Nathaniel Wright lived from 1908 to 1960 and was an American author of novels, short stories, poems, and nonfiction. Much of his literature concerns racial themes, especially related to the plight of African Americans during the late 19th and mid-20th centuries, suffering discrimination and violence. Richard Wright's best-known works include the novella collection Uncle Tom's Children, published in 1938, the novel Native Son, published in 1940, and the memoir Black Boy, published in 1945. Literary critics believe his work helped change race relations in the United States in the mid-20th century. And Wikipedia says, Native Son, published 1940, is a novel written by the American author Richard Wright. It tells the story of 20-year-old Bigger Thomas, a black youth living in utter poverty in a poor area of Chicago's South Side in the 1930s. Thomas accidentally kills a white woman at a time when racism is at its peak, and he pays the price for it. While not apologizing for Bigger's crimes, Wright portrays a systemic causation behind them. Bigger's lawyer Boris Max makes the case that there is no escape from this destiny for his client or any other black Americans, since they are the necessary product of the society that formed them and told them since birth who exactly they were supposed to be. Back to the text. A fierce polemic aimed at black workers, the pamphlet opens with a stirring poem by the West Indian writer Claude McKay, titled If We Must Die, and is written from the standpoint of a married, quote, black working man whose, quote, people were here as early as the family of President Roosevelt, end quote. Wikipedia says Claude McKay lived from 1890 to 1948 and was a Jamaican-American writer and poet. Claude McKay was central in the Harlem Renaissance. Born in Jamaica, McKay first traveled to the United States to attend college and encountered W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, which stimulated McKay's interest in political involvement. He moved to New York City in 1914, and in 1919 he wrote the poem If We Must Die, one of his best-known works. A widely reprinted sonnet responding to the wave of white-on-black race riots and lynchings following the conclusion of the First World War. Claude McKay also wrote 5 novels: Home to Harlem, published in 1928, a bestseller that won the Harman Gold Award for Literature; Banjo, published in 1929, Banana Bottom, published in 1933, Harlem Glory, written 1938 to 1940, published in 1990, Amiable with Big Teeth, a novel, The Love Affair Between the Communists and the Poor Black Sheep of Harlem, written in 1941, published in 2017, and a novella, Romance in Marseille, written in 1933, published in 2020. Besides these novels and 4 published collections of poetry, Claude McKay also authored a collection of short stories, Gingertown, published 1932, 2 autobiographical books, A Long Way From Home, 1937, and My Green Hills of Jamaica, published posthumously in 1979, and Harlem Negro Metropolis, published 1940, consisting of 11 essays on the contemporary social and political history of Harlem and Manhattan, concerned especially with political, social, and labor organizing. Claude McKay's This is kind of becoming this is a very long introduction, Jesus Christ. Back to the text. Wikipedia says, If We Must Die is a poem by Jamaican-born writer Claude McKay, who lived from 1890 to 1948, published in July 1919 issue of the Liberator magazine. McKay wrote the poem in response to mob attacks by white Americans upon African-American communities during the Red Summer. The poem does not specifically reference any group of people and has been used to represent many groups who are persecuted. It is considered one of McKay's most famous poems and was described by the poet Gwendolyn Brooks as one of the most famous poems of all time. Back to the text. Footnote. The first stanza of the poem reads, If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. End footnote. And footnote, Native Son, My Friends, A Fireside Chat on the War, published by the Workers' Party, 1940. Posing the question, is America in danger? Native Son answers that the real danger comes from within, from Senator Bilbo, Vice President Garner, all of them aided by you, President Roosevelt, for all of you are in one party together, the Democratic Party, ... End quote. As the author goes on to insist, quote, when we have defeated the enemies of democracy here, then we can give Hitler a beating, end quote. This passionate but odd and strangely disingenuous pamphlet ends on the following note, quote, I went to the last war. I was treated like a dog before I went. I was treated like a dog while I was there. I was treated like a dog when I returned. I have been played for a sucker before, and I'm not going to be played again, end quote. On the next page, an advertisement for the Workers' Party summarizing the party's position on Negro equality. Footnote, quote, the Workers' Party stands for ... the right to vote and be voted for everywhere throughout the country. The right to hold office, any office from the lowest to the highest. The right to be free from insult, degradation, and proscription. The right to work at any job for which the Negro is qualified, bracket, sick, end bracket, and to be paid the same wages received by other workers, end quote. Native Son, my friends. End footnote. It was in this period that C.L.R. James adopted J.R. Johnson as his primary nom de plume. James seemed almost proud of his marginal underground existence, evidently shedding whatever interest in broad influence or literary prominence James may have once had. At the same time, James felt thwarted by the fact that he could no longer address public meetings, as much of his intellectual inspiration had previously come from lecturing to diverse audiences. James' status as a semi-fugitive served to confirm the seriousness of James's commitment to Marxism, but it also meant that James had little money or personal security. James sounded a little conflicted when talking about his own life in a letter written to Constance Webb in 1943, quote, these last 3 years have been the most exciting intellectually of my life, ... I have aged a little, grayer in the temples, a little thinner, not much, a little more serious, a few lines in my face, my hands are more nervous than before, but I am much the same, quieter externally, much more explosive inside, and very sure of what I am doing politically, of myself as a person, doubtful, and more than a little worried as to my future, end quote. James, letter to Constance Webb, August 26, 1943. In an earlier letter, James sounded somewhat fierce and sly, quote, I am a rather unusual combination. I am 40-odd and have obviously traveled and seen the world and read a great deal, and at the same time, in my attitude to life and my outlook, I am quite young, do not live in the past at all, and haven't the faintest trace of complaint against the world, though I know it for what it is, end quote. James to Constance Webb, 1942. One senses that James was more open about his private feelings with Constance Webb than with other comrades and friends. Not really finding anything good for Constance Webb. Constance played an absolutely pivotal role in James's life in this period. Their correspondence, which began in 1939, generated literally hundreds of letters and thousands of pages of handwritten text by the late 1940s. As Selwyn Cudjoe has noted, Quote, when one realized the physical pains James underwent when he used a pen, ... it dawns on the reader that writing these letters was a monumental task of love and devotion. End quote. Footnote. Selwyn Cudjoe, The Love Letters of C.L.R. James, published in Trinidad and Tobago Review. Although many of the letters address questions of political theory or literature, James uses considerable compositional skills to flatter and court the young woman who was just starting out on a career as a model actress and writer. Vowing to be a good husband and to instruct her in the inner workings of the dialectic, James married Constance Webb in May 1946 and again in 1948, when the divorce from Juanita Young James was officially recognized by the U.S. immigration authorities. Apart from rare exceptions such as those noted here, however, James rarely reflected on his own mood, preferring instead to adopt the famous reserve of the hard-bitten revolutionary, and not coincidentally of the English gentleman. Life was never more uncertain than when James spent 5 months in Missouri engaged in strike support work. The Workers' Party's St. Louis branch had made contact with a handful of black sharecroppers and union activists in the southern part of the state. By 1941, a strike was likely, and James traveled from New York to cover the story for the Workers' Party newspaper Labor Action. In late May, some 8,000 members of Local 313 of the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America went on strike for 30 cents an hour, 45 cents an hour for tractor drivers, and time and a half for overtime after 10 hours. The standard pay rate in the fields had been a desultory $1.25 per day. Despite the reasonableness of the strikers' claims, the cannery union's national leadership was at best lukewarm about the strike. Like that of other left-led Congress of industrial organizations, unions at the time, the union's leadership was aligned with the Communist Party, which was committed to the war effort and was strongly inclined to oppose disruptive strikes. This gave James and the Workers' Party an interesting angle to pursue as they labored to help the strikers. James had written that, quote, the Negroes try to organize themselves and must be aided in the attempts to prepare a strike force, end quote. Footnote. James, as J.R. Johnson, Negro Masses in the Struggle for World Socialism, published in Labor Action, 28th of April, 1941. James had meant this generally, but could now apply the idea in practice. Did I say end footnote? James had meant this generally, but could now apply the idea in practice. Forging the all-black organization that Trotsky had supported was hardly in the cards, but black discontent still existed, and it could be inflamed. James described a meeting he had with the activist leadership of Local 313. Quote, I called some of the leaders together and said, quote, we have to publish something for everyone to read about, end quote. They said yes. So I sat down with my pen and notebook and said, well, what should we say? So I used to call myself Williams. They said, quote, well, Brother Williams, you know, end quote. I said, quote, I know nothing. This is your strike, end quote. ... And I went to each of them, 5 or 6 of them. Each said his piece, and I joined them together. End quote. C.L.R. James, 1977 preface to Down with Starvation Wages in Southeast Missouri, published 1941, reprinted in C.L.R. James, The Future and the Present Selected Writings. Hundreds of copies of the resultant pamphlet, Down with Starvation Wages in Southeast Missouri, found their way to sharecroppers, union activists, church leaders, and other concerned parties throughout the Middle West. Footnote. The cover of the unsigned pamphlet reads, Down with Starvation Wages in Southeast Missouri, 30 cents an hour, white and colored together, end quote. The back cover lists the strikers' demands, and the inside front cover reads, Black and white, unite and fight. End footnote. Small enough to fit into your back pocket, the pamphlet was only 6 inches long and 4.5 inches wide. Down with Starvation Wages was written in an accessible anecdotal style. It sold for a penny. A section addressed to rural preachers read, quote, all the preachers must get their flock together and preach to them about the union and solidarity in the struggle. If a preacher is not with us, he is against us. That is the voice of Scripture. Also, the laborer is worthy of his hire. The laborer is worthy of his hire. That is Scripture also, ... Solidarity in the union, that is the way to get the kingdom of heaven upon the earth. Or upon earth, excuse me. End quote. The section labeled, quote, to the merchants, hit a plaintive note, Quote, we say to the merchants, why don't you support us? Every penny we get, we spend with you. We cannot save anything. If we get 30 cents an hour, it means we are able to buy a little more lard, a little more bread, a piece of meat once a week while the money lasts. After that, we'll starve again. But it all goes to the merchant to raise his income. So we look to the merchant, especially the little merchant, to support us and stand by us if we are compelled to strike. If during the strike we ask for a little credit, then the merchant must give it. End quote. James, down with starvation wages in southeast Missouri. But winning the strike took more than polemics. The National Union was grudging in its support. The Farm Security Administration was sympathetic to the cotton landlords, and the local press was openly hostile to trade unionism in any form. Despite the forces arrayed against them, however, the strikers won their demands after 11 weeks. The cause of their victory was the fact that the landlords were desperate that the crops be harvested before abundant weeds strangled the fields of cotton. Local 313 had secured the first rank-and-file Union victory since the start of the war. Labor Action's on the scene reporter returned to New York a hero among comrades. Footnote. It is unclear how much time James actually spent among sharecroppers in southeast Missouri, as opposed to meeting with their leaders in St. Louis. Albert Glotzer, whose party name was Albert Gates, stated in an unpublished letter sent to the New York Times in 1985 that, quote, James never organized or taught tenant farmers. I was secretary of the Workers' Party when it sent James, quote, into the field, end quote, to assist in the work of its St. Louis branch. He was specifically instructed to stay out of southeast Missouri, where the Tenant Farmers Union was located. James's British West Indian accent would put him in jeopardy in this area of terror against Union activity, end quote. Bull says James, quote, volunteered to go to southeastern Missouri, end quote, but also reports that, quote, he spent most of his time in St. Louis with only occasional forays into the countryside, ... end quote. By contrast, Consuelo Lopez asserts that James spent several months in Lilburn's South Delmo housing project. Certainly, James's many articles for Labor Action would suggest that he spent more time in the area than Glotzer would allow. See Paul Bull, C.L.R. James, The Artist as Revolutionary, published 1988, and Consuelo Lopez's article, C.L.R. James, The Rhetoric of a Defiant Warrior, unpublished dissertation, 1983, with Indiana University. The sharecropper strike seemed to confirm the wisdom of the perspective James had outlined in his meetings with Trotsky. The strike suggested that certain sectors were ready to channel their frustration and anger into class-based mobilization. Of great symbolic significance was the fact that James had written down the sharecroppers' words, rather than formulating their demands. The strike's successful conclusion seemed to validate James's overall approach. The sharecroppers, overwhelmingly but not exclusively black, forged alliances with trade unionists in St. Louis as well as Protestant congregations across Missouri. In a small way, the strike, quote, intervened with terrific force upon the general social and political life of the nation, end quote. James, The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the USA, published in 1948, reprinted in Anna Grimshaw's edited volume, The C.L.R. James Reader. End footnote. The trip to Missouri also confirmed what had been obvious since Coyoacán. James's Pan-Africanism had developed into a specific concern with African American politics and culture. This is not to suggest that James was no longer a Pan-Africanist, since the question of the history and social movements of American blacks were important from the standpoint of the entire African diaspora. But in America, James was more than a New York-based correspondent for international African opinion. Although James informally served in that capacity until the International African Service Bureau's journal folded as a result of wartime paper shortages, James was a serious student of Black America. Footnote. With George Padmore, T.R. McConan, Wallace Johnson, Jomo Kenyatta, and Peter Abrahams, James served as an advisory editor to the IASB's wartime pamphlet series, which published at least 5 titles, including Kenyatta Kenya's Land of Conflict, published in 1945, and Eric Williams' The Negro in the Caribbean. I've tried to look up the Negro in the Caribbean, but I haven't looked up Jomo Kenyatta's Kenya, the Land of Conflict. I'm not seeing any descriptions for that. End footnote. This became evident not only in James's discussions with Trotsky and work in Missouri, but in the voluminous documents James generated on the subject for labor action and the Workers' Party's journal, New International. After the 1940 split, the Socialist Workers' Party launched a new journal, Fourth International, while the Shattumites retained control over the New International. James contributed over 20 articles to the post-split New International between 1940 and 1947. James's journalism was animated by the same optimistically, quote, pro-autonomy, end quote, framework that characterized his whole approach to the race question in America. In his regular column titled One-Tenth the Nation, also called The Negro Fight, James discusses novels, segregation, industrial relations, relations between the sexes, and whatever else happened to be in the news. A recurrent motif was that American society was due for a major shakeup. Nothing was static. Blacks were arriving at a new stage of self-awareness, and sooner or later would move in the direction of independent political action. Certainly the Democrats seemed incapable of providing any kind of leadership in the area of civil rights. Through concrete activity, blacks would discover their collective power and find their natural allies. The logic of the struggle would teach African Americans about politics, about class politics, and about socialism. In effect, the multifaceted movement toward freedom, and not the vanguard party, would produce the next generation of revolutionaries, black and white. James recognized that many obstacles lay on the road to social and political equality. One of James's characteristic themes was that racial prejudice was deeply ingrained in the culture. Quote, in books and magazines, end quote, James pointed out, quote, all grace, strength, beauty, nobility, courage are automatically attributed to members of the white race, ... If he, bracket, the black man, end bracket, is included, he is placed in his usual menial position, made the butt of jokes, or at best portrayed as a good and loyal servant, end quote. Footnote, J.R. Johnson, One-Tenth the Nation, Labor Action, April 23, 1945. Other articles concerned important figures in black history. Given the formative impact of the Negro world on his political development and his overall sympathy for all black organizations and programs, it seems surprising that he engaged in a bitter polemic against Marcus Garvey. Quote, Garvey, however, was a race fanatic. Garvey's appeal was to black against white. Garvey wanted purity of race. A great part of Garvey's propaganda was based on the achievements of blacks, the past achievements of blacks, ... With that disregard of facts which characterizes the born demagogue, he proclaimed that there were 400 million Negroes in the world, when there are certainly not half as many. What does this remind us of? Who but Adolf Hitler? End quote. I don't know if Worcester will say this, but I believe that Marcus Garvey indeed called himself a black fascist.
or like said that he beat fascism. He invented fascism, and fascism was like, in some sense, maybe not ripping off his ideas, but coming to the conclusions that he had already come to, or something like in that capacity. I'm not exactly sure. Back to the text. That quote, actually, footnote, was from J.R. Johnson's article, Marcus Garvey, published in Labor Action, June 24th, 1940. Despite his sympathetic theoretical framework, James had never adopted a black nationalist approach and had always been critical of Garvey's political practice. James offered a more characteristic view of Garvey's contribution many years later, however. Quote, Marcus Garvey was not a scholarly man. Marcus Garvey was careless in things he said. Marcus Garvey used to say 400 million Negroes, multiplying the number by 2. That is okay with me. He could have multiplied by 3 as far as I'm concerned. He was saying something that had to be said. End quote. James, On the Origins, page 24. One of the ingredients that went into James's work on black politics was his frank anti-Stalinism. Unlike later historians of the so-called revisionist school, or indeed many minorities in the United States and elsewhere who were then active on the left, James regarded the policies of the Communist Party as an unmitigated disaster, especially for blacks and workers. Footnote. See Maurice Eiserman, Which Side Were You On? The American Communist Party During the Second World War, published in 1982, Mark Nason, Communists in Harlem During the Depression, published in 1983, see Michael E. Brown, Randy Martin, Frank Rosegart, and George Snedeker's edited volume, New Studies in the Politics and Culture of U.S. Communism, published with Monthly Review Press in 1992. The description that I'm seeing on Amazon for Which Side Were You On? The American Communist Party During the Second World War by Maurice Eiserman says, Maurice Eiserman's thorough and remarkably even-tempered history of the CPUSA from 1938 to 1946 draws on materials only recently available, the Browder Papers, recent autobiographies of communists and ex-communists, and interviews with participants. Communists in Harlem During the Depression by Mark Nason, The Origins and Impact of America's Black Left. The description says, no socialist organization has ever had a more profound effect on black life than the Communist Party did in Harlem during the Depression. Mark Nason describes how the party won the early endorsement of such people as Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and how its support of racial equality and integration impressed black intellectuals including Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, and Paul Robeson. This meticulously researched work, largely based on primary materials and interviews with leading black communists from the 1930s, is the first to fully explore this provocative encounter between whites and blacks. It provides a detailed look at an exciting period of reform, as well as an intimate portrait of Harlem in the 1920s and 1930s at the high point of its influence and pride. And Michael E. Brown, Randy Martin, Frank Rosegart, and George Snedeker's edited volume, New Studies in the Politics and Culture of U.S. Communism, is published with Monthly Review Press. and its description says, "This path-breaking collection of essays recast the prevailing conceptions of the historical roots and role of the U.S. Communist Party and its social setting. The contributors focus on the movement that formed around the party and the popular culture it expressed, particularly in the period from 1930 to 1960. They look at the impact of the party and its followers in the areas of education, literature, and the arts in the African American community, and on the women's and labor movements." Back to the text. End footnote. As James wrote in the New International, quote, "The policy of Stalinism in regard to the working masses everywhere is universally recognized as a policy of manipulation." Footnote. See CLR James, Stalinism and Negro History, published in 1949, reprinted in McClemmy and LeBlanc's edited volume, CLR James and Revolutionary Marxism. The party trained its cadre to lie to outsiders. End footnote. The party trained its cadre to lie to outsiders and to bully new members. The party falsely claimed that there was no racial prejudice in the Soviet Union, and the party represented bureaucratic tyranny as socialist liberation. As the branch office of an internal national conspiracy, the American Communist Party stood for ideological conformity, the betrayal of the working class, and the political economy of state capitalism. For James and others on the anti-Stalinist left, communism remained a, quote, "pernicious impediment to the development of a genuinely radical alternative." Footnote. See James, Stalinism and Negro History, page 204. In this view, the fact that the party curbed its rhetoric in favor of a tacit alliance with liberals through the stratagem of the Popular Front changed nothing. The Popular Front was itself a cynical deception that had nothing to do with empowering the masses and everything to do with the considerations of international relations and statecraft. As a result of his unblemished anti-Stalinism, James was characteristically suspicious when it came to the influence of the Communist Party in the literary arts and black communities. An admiring review of Richard Wright's Native Son, published in 1940, suggests the tenor of James's approach. As a novelist, Wright clearly exhibited tremendous potential, and James went out of his way to praise the young author's somber, naturalistic work. But James also warned that Wright's talents would be, quote, blighted if Wright continued to participate in the activities of the Communist Party. Quote, "Wright is a Stalinist," end quote, James wrote, "and in that, quote, evil garden, nothing creative flourishes. The artist in uniform soon ceases to be an artist. The Stalinists are past masters in the art of enveloping, suborning, corrupting. It will be a pity if they succeed in perverting and blighting this splendid talent," end quote. James. And that was as J.R. Johnson, Native Son and Revolution, published in 1940, reprinted in McClemmy and LeBlanc's edited volume, CLR James and Revolutionary Marxism, page 91. End footnote. These gloomy lines were penned at a time when the Communist Party was approaching the peak of its influence in the United States as a political organization and a constitutive element in the, quote, progressive current in the fields of literature, culture, and the media. Yet once he became famous, Wright's party membership represented a special coup. The evident appeal of the communist movement for figures such as Wright and Paul Robeson must have been grating for an anti-Stalinist like James. A bittersweet interest, some would argue obsession, in the party's malign impact on the cultural community was to become a hallmark of the Workers' Party itself. Richard Wright had joined the Communist Party in Chicago in 1934, at the height of the Depression, and Richard Wright was active in a couple of communist literary groups, although he was never entirely reconciled to the party's dogmatic and authoritarian style. Wright's private break from the party finally came in 1942 and was announced with the publication of I Tried to Be a Communist, which appeared on The Atlantic in the summer of 1944. Not coincidentally, this was the same period that Constance and CLR spent a great deal of time in the company of the ex-communist author and his wife, Ellen. The Wrights introduced Constance and her future spouse to the group Richard called his, quote, thinking coterie, end quote, whose members included sociologist Horace Caton and St. Clair Drake, novelist Ralph Ellison and Chester Himes, and others such as Minette Flower, E. Franklin Frazier, Lawrence D. Reddick, and Melvin B. Tolson. Footnote. See Fabre, or Fabe, F-A-B-R-E, The Unfinished Quest of Richard Wright. Page 262. The Unfinished Quest of Richard Wright, published by Michel Fabe, is probably how you actually say it. I thought it was Michael. Does it say Michael in the footnote? I don't know. It just says Fabe. But it's Michel Fabe, and it says widely acclaimed for its comprehensive and sensitive picture of one of America's most renowned writers. The Unfinished Quest of Richard Wright received the Anisfield Wolf Award on Race Relations. This first paperback edition contains a new preface and bibliographic essay, updating changes in the author's approach to his subject and discussing works published on Wright since 1973. End footnote. By the mid-1940s, Constance Webb had become interested in her own writing projects. One project drew on these new relationships and took the form of an untitled 150-page pamphlet that Constance and CLR circulated in 1944. The pamphlet came in two parts. A, quote, a hitherto unpublished manuscript by Richard Wright, being a continuation of Black Boy, end quote. And B, quote, notes preliminary to a fuller study of the work of Richard Wright by Constance Webb, end quote. Footnote. Constance Webb, untitled pamphlet, self-published, 1944. I located a copy of this pamphlet in the rare book collection at Columbia University's Butler Library, where it had been deposited by Mayor Shapiro. Only 100 copies of the pamphlet were ever issued. While the cover lacks any markings of any kind, the inside cover reads, quote, strictly private circulation. Each copy is numbered and is not to be sold or exchanged, end quote. Constance Webb. Excuse me. I don't know why I said Constance Webb. It's not Constance Webb. Anyway, end footnote. While Black Boy, a record of childhood and youth, had been published by Harper and Brothers in 1945, this edition contained only the first half, titled Southern Night, of a longer manuscript, American Hunger, that was eventually published in its entirety in 1977. The description for Black Boy, a record of childhood and youth by Richard Wright, says, when Black Boy exploded onto the literary scene in 1945, Black Boy caused a sensation. Orville Prescott of the New York Times wrote that, quote, if enough such books are written, if enough millions of people read them, maybe someday in the fullness of time, there will be a greater understanding and a more true democracy, end quote. Opposing forces felt compelled to comment. Addressing Congress, Senator Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi argued that the purpose of this book, quote, was to plant seeds of hate and devilment in the minds of every American, end quote. From 1975 to 1978, Black Boy was banned in schools throughout the United States for, quote, obscenity and, quote, instigating hatred between the races. This new edition of the once controversial, now classic American autobiography measures the brutality and rawness of the Jim Crow South against the sheer desperate will it took to survive as a, quote, black boy. Richard Wright grew up in the woods of Mississippi with poverty, hunger, fear, and hatred. He lied, stole, and raged at those about him. At 6, he was a, quote, drunkard, hanging out about taverns. Surly, brutal, cold, suspicious, and self-pitying, he was surrounded on one side by whites who were either indifferent to him, pitying, or cruel, on the other by blacks who resented anyone trying to rise above the common lot. At the end of Black Boy, Wright sits poised with pencil in hand, determined to, quote, hurl worlds into this darkness and wait for an echo, end quote. Wright's eloquent account is at once a profound indictment and an unashamed confession, a poignant and disturbing record of social injustice and human suffering. Back to the text. Let's look up American Hunger. American Hunger, the description for American Hunger by Richard Wright says, a continuation of Black Boy, Wright's acclaimed autobiographical work, calls attention to his first years in the North, his struggle to become a writer, and his brief association with the Communist Party. Back to the text. Webb's 1944 pamphlet made available to a select few a lengthy extract from the second half of Wright's manuscript, which Wright titled The Honor and the Glory, and which recounted the author's experiences in Chicago and with the Communist Party. It had been excised from the 1945 edition after editors at the Book of the Month Club had objected to the manuscript's length. Webb's preliminary notes chart Wright's lonely passage from communism to existentialism, locating interesting parallels between his early fiction and that of Chester Himes, who, at that time, seemed to express greater openness to the ideals of revolutionary socialism. Chester Himes lived from 1909 to 1984. Chester Himes was an American writer. Chester Himes' works, some of which have been filmed, include If He Hollers, Let Him Go, published in 1945, and the Harlem Detective series of novels for which he is best known, set in the 1950s and early 1960s, and featuring two black policemen called Gravedigger Jones and Coffin Ed Johnson. In 1958, Himes won France's Grand Prix de Littérature Policière. Which is an award for detective fiction. Back to the text. Webb's main argument is that Wright's unhappy turn towards existentialism reflected a wider difficulty, one facing a number of black secular intellectuals who had become disenchanted with communism. Constance Webb writes, quote, the Communist Party gave Wright the first sustained relationships to his life. They showed Wright the ideals of future collective living embodied in an immediate community life with other members, and more important than anything else, they linked up the collective life on a local scale with the lives of millions of rebellious and persecuted people all over the world. But they crushed every hope they had awakened. Unlike white liberal intellectuals who rejoin society when they become disillusioned, Wright the Negro has nowhere to go. He retreats into himself, into the circle of absolute loneliness, the area of dread, anguish, and psychic pain. End quote. Constance Webb, untitled pamphlet. With its references to, quote, dread and, quote, psychic pain, this passage very likely draws on conversations that Webb herself had with the novelist, but the counsel proffered in the pamphlet that Wright should find a way to align himself with the cause of organized labor, artlessly presupposed that working-class politics constituted the only true path to personal happiness. Footnote, quote, Wright's failure is his failure to see the individual, black and white, as representative of great social forces in motion. In all his work, there is no mention of organized labor. The exclusion is not an oversight. He has never seen or been involved in the labor movement, end quote. Constance Webb, untitled pamphlet. 5 years later, Constance Webb reiterated these charges, quote, when he lived in Chicago in 1932, the labor movement, as it is known today, reaching into every section of society, did not exist. His jobs were solitary, unconnected with large groups of workers. He worked as a house servant, a dishwasher, errand boy, a postal clerk, a janitor, so that any tendency towards individual thinking was reinforced by his type of work. ... Wright's strength and his weakness are products of the period in which he came to maturity, end quote. Constance Webb, What Next for Richard Wright? Published in Phylon, the Atlanta University Review of Race and Culture, 1949. End footnote. It was in this period that Wright and his friend Horace Caton talked about launching a journal of black opinion, which Wright wanted to call American Pages, with the subtitle, A Magazine Reflecting a Minority Mood and Point of View, non-partisan, non-political, espousing no current creed, ideology, or organization. Footnote, see Constance Webb, Richard Wright, A Biography. Published with Putnam's Sons, 1968. Constance Webb's book was the first full-scale biography of Wright, and it received mixed reviews. Michel Fabre, in his book The Unfinished Quest of Richard Wright, is quite critical of Webb's effort, as another biographer, Margaret Walker, who claims that Webb, quote, failed to be sufficiently objective and was frequently inaccurate, revealing her ignorance of simple dates, places, and records of literary works, end quote. See Margaret Walker's book, Demonic Genius, A Portrait of the Man, a critical look of his work. I don't know if that's supposed to say at his work. I don't know. Published in 1988. Walker quotes from a Newsweek review by Saul Malhoff that called Richard Wright, A Biography, quote, chaotically organized and absurdly inconclusive, end quote. However, the back cover of Webb's book features a plug from the writer Gwendolyn Brooks, who calls it, quote, remarkably inclusive, ... Publication of it is a very large event, end quote. End footnote. Wikipedia says Horace Caton Sr. lived from 1859 to 1940. Horace Caton was an American journalist and political activist, the son of a slave and white plantation owner. Is this... Maybe it's Horace Clayton Jr. Yeah, I think this is probably who's being talked about here. Horace Roscoe Caton Jr. lived from 1903 to 1970, was a prominent American sociologist, newspaper columnist, and writer who specialized in studies of working-class black Americans, particularly in mid-20th century Chicago. Horace Caton is best remembered as the co-author of a seminal 1945 study of Southside Chicago, titled Black Metropolis, a study of Negro life in a northern city. And back to the text. I want to look up some of these books, some of the footnotes. Constance Webb, Richard Wright, A Biography. Um, Not seeing any description for Webb's book on Richard Wright. Already looked up Michel Faub's The Unfinished Quest of Richard Wright. And we're going to look up Demonic Genius, A Portrait of a Man, a critical look at his work. The description for this book just says, a friend and fellow writer offers a portrait of the late American novelist, discusses his political beliefs, and looks at his major works. Yeah. Alright, so end footnote, back to the text. To raise interest in the project, they talked to a number of friends and potential contributors, such as James, Ralph Ellison, James T. Farrell, Bernard Wolfe, and others. The prospective editors started from the assumption that black writers and readers needed an independent outlet for their diverse opinions, one that was not affiliated with either the Communist or Democratic parties. At the same time, the journal would have been aimed at enlightened whites, such as James T. Farrell. Wikipedia says James T. Farrell lived from 1904 to 1979 and was an American novelist, short story writer, and poet. James T. Farrell is most remembered for the Studs Lonergan trilogy, which was made into a film in 1960 and a television series in 1979. Back to the text. As Webb noted in her biography of Wright, American Pages was to have featured a Jamesian-style compendium of, quote, fiction, articles, essays, poetry, cartoons, profiles of individuals who lived, quote, the American way, end quote, such as Frank Sinatra, Gene Krupa, Francis Farmer, surveys on race tensions, popularly written, excerpts from novels which revealed the American scene, studies of crime and criminals, black and white, end quote. Constance Webb, Richard Wright, page 220. The lengthy subtitle given to American Pages connotes the opinion and culture blend pioneered by the newspaper correspondence, which James Dostoevsky and several dozen of their supporters produced after leaving the Trotskyist movement in the early 1950s. Richard Wright and Horace Caton also talked to Ralph Ellison and James about working together on a book project to be titled The Negro Speaks. Footnote. See Arnold Rampersad's notes to Richard Wright, early works. Horace Caton says that he and Richard Wright planned to collaborate on an anthology, quote, to which he would invite a number of Negro students and intellectuals to contribute. We held one meeting in Wright's Brooklyn apartment, and among those whom I remembered being there was Ralph Ellison and Sia Lahr, a West Indian Negro who is an anti-communist Marxist. This project, for some reason that I cannot recall, fell through. Horace Caton, Long Old Road. The description of Horace Caton's Long Old Road Back to Black Metropolis by Horace Caton's Long Old Road Back to Black Metropolis says, from the time that he ran away to sea at 16 until he graduated from the University of Washington, Horace R. Caton was a messman on a freighter, an unknowing handyman in an Alaskan brothel, a juvenile delinquent and inmate of a reform school, a dock worker and steward on a passenger liner, and a deputy in the sheriff's office of King County, Washington. Born in Seattle, a city then uniquely free from racial tensions and prejudices, Caton found the privileged, secure middle-class position of his well-to-do parents ineffectual against the gradual spread of racism that was sweeping America. His disarmingly honest autobiography is the ever-absorbing record of an intelligent, sensitive, and proud man's attempts to find identity, a confusing and conflicting chaos of black and white in a nation that, although dedicated to equality, somehow managed to deny this ideal by almost every action. Although Caton's turbulent life was complicated by the color barrier, often resulting in reverses and frustrations that have rendered him close to a breakdown, this alone is not what makes Caton's books such captivating reading. Wholly lacking in self-pity or special pleading, Horace Caton has written a personal narrative of unfailing interest on any number of scores, a book that ranks with the best of American autobiographical writing, for it manages to remain highly critical without once resorting to bitterness, to be filled with hope, though not always hopeful, and brims with compassion and bemused and acute insights into a troubled society. It is a telling, almost poetic tribute to the resiliency of black culture. And that was the description for Long Old Road Back to Black Metropolis by Horace Caton. End footnote. Back to the text, end footnote. Although Richard Wright never expressed any interest in joining the Workers' Party, Richard Wright was certainly friendly with one of its leading, albeit dissident members. The proposed collaboration never really got off the ground, however, in part because of Ellen and Richard's restlessness, which led to their departure for Paris in 1947. Footnote: Constance Webb describes a champagne party that the Wrights hosted in their first-class stateroom on the SS United States before it set sail for Paris. See Constance, CLR, Ralph Ellison, Bernard Wolfe, and Mrs. Daniel Green were all in attendance. Back to the text. Financial considerations similarly constrained the circle's ambitions. An additional factor was the fact that some of James's political associates feared that these projects would distract him from the more important task of reconstructing Marxism. Finally, Wright may have come to appreciate that the gulf between his own existentialism and James's Hegelian neo-Trotskyism was virtually insurmountable. Although in one way or another James was spending a considerable amount of time observing the African American community and immersing himself in black culture, James was unable to find a way of addressing a mass black audience. The closest James came was via the Workers' Party newspaper, Labor Action, which enjoyed a circulation of tens of thousands of copies. It was distributed free of charge at dozens of factories throughout California, the industrial Midwest, and the Northeast, and whose wartime readership reflected the incomplete integration of large-scale manufacturing. Footnote: Author's interview with Julius and Phyllis Jacobson. End footnote. James' more theoretical contributions, however, published in New International and in internal bulletins, reached only a few hundred people.
Yet his interventions inside the American Trotskyist movement allowed James to refine the analysis that he had first advanced in Coyoacán. Two interventions are of particular note. The first took place in 1944, when the Workers' Party sponsored an internal debate over whether racial integration or James's pro-autonomy perspective was the correct revolutionary position. The circle around Max Shachtman were concerned that James had a tendency to push the, quote, independent organization, end quote, perspective on black politics too far. These leaders wondered what the connection was between autonomous black struggles and the goal of forging a multiracial revolutionary organization. Labor Action adopted the slogan, quote, black and white, unite and fight, end quote, whereas the position of James and his comrades inside the Workers' Party, the Johnson Forest Tendency, which had been constituted in 1941 as a result of the collaborations of James, Johnson, and Dunayevskaya Forrest to advance the theory of state capitalism and develop Marxist theory and practice, was that blacks would have to form their own black-led organizations to advance their particular interests. Arguing on behalf of the traditional socialist approach was Ernest McKinney. I'm not seeing any good descriptions of Ernest McKinney. Arguing on behalf of the traditional socialist approach was Ernest McKinney, a journalist who had been politically active for several decades. McKinney, who was black, had extensive experience with the trade union movement and was employed by the party on a full-time basis to work on labor issues. Writing under the nom de plume, David Coolidge, McKinney argued that racial animus would slowly dissipate as the U.S. workforce was integrated through the application of capitalist technology. He further asserted that struggles for civil rights had no intrinsically leftist or revolutionary character. As McKinney wrote, quote, under the present leadership, white or Negro, the struggle is and will be carried on entirely within the framework of bourgeois democracy and capitalism. The program of this leadership does not include a struggle against capitalism now or in the future, ... end quote. McKinney warned, quote, the Workers' Party is not unaware that Negroes have been indoctrinated with ideas of racial separation, racial sufficiency, and racial autarky. These dogmas have paraded under a banner labeled, quote, race consciousness, end quote. The most extreme form of this is promulgated by the advocates of black chauvinism or Negro nationalism, end quote. McKinney. David, or under the nom de plume of David Coolidge, Negroes and the Revolution. The harshness of McKinney's contribution, which was reprinted in New International, reflected his concern that the, quote, Johnsonite position sanctioned a kind of reverse racism which romanticized black movements and downplayed the class struggle. McKinney was pessimistic as to whether blacks would come to an anti-capitalist perspective unless they were guided by an explicitly socialist organization armed with a revolutionary program such as the Workers' Party. And he saw civil rights leaders as wielding a troublesome influence on black consciousness. Along with the other Workers' Party cadre, McKinney believed that autonomous black struggles constituted a particular type of threat to the task of consolidating revolutionary forces in America. James's views were quite different. Building on the 1939 conversations with Trotsky, McKinney's adversaries predicted that, quote, to the degree that the Negroes are more integrated into the unions, bracket, and industry, end bracket, their consciousness of racial oppression and their resentment against it become greater, not less, end quote. James. Race-based discrimination would end not with the integration of America's workplaces. Pace McKinney, the apparently prosaic struggle for civil and political rights had a revolutionary dimension. Quote, the Negro struggle for democratic rights is not a concession that Marxists make to the Negroes. In the United States today, this struggle is a direct part of the struggle for socialism, end quote. James. In tackling unjust laws, backward attitudes, and discriminatory practices, black protesters would find themselves challenging the very edifice of American capitalism. The, quote, natural excess of the desire for equality, end quote, that James identified in black nationalist ideology contained the seeds of a far-reaching indictment of American society. If McKinney was right, then virtually no expression of black pride hindered class unity. If McKinney was right, then virtually any expression of black pride hindered class unity. The job of socialists would be to work inside the trade union movement and push for the integration of industry. On the other hand, if James was right, then even an imperfect black nationalism could ignite and deepen social antagonisms and thereby contribute to, quote, the struggle for socialism, end quote. The implications of the latter perspective was that Trotskyists would have to learn how to work alongside an entire constellation of groups and movements struggling for social emancipation. 2 years after this inconclusive debate took place, the grouping around Dunayevskaya and James bolted from the Workers' Party, and after a few months of independent activity applied to join the Socialist Workers' Party in late 1947. A good percentage of the group's members had been active in the Socialist Workers' Party before the 1940s split and familiar with the strengths and weaknesses of Kennan's organization. James Dunayevskaya and the others convinced themselves that in its own, somewhat crude fashion, the Socialist Workers' Party was still committed to revolutionary politics. After the war had ended, the Socialist Workers' Party predicted that a new upsurge in union militancy and social conflict was on the way. This is also the position of the Johnson Forest Tendency, and the Socialist Workers' Party had been making secretive overtures to the embattled Workers' Party faction for some time, even as it was considered a merger with the Shachtmanites. Socialist Workers' Party leaders were particularly concerned about the difficulty the party was having in recruiting and retaining black members. With James's expertise on the question of black politics, and with their natural interest in adding new members, including the Johnson Forest Tendency, into the party, was an especially attractive prospect to the Canaanites. Martin Glaberman characterized the Socialist Workers' Party in this period as, quote, going through a tremendous crisis on the Negro question. So they, really welcomed James, who gave the report on black politics at the next convention, end quote. Footnote, author's interview with Martin Glaberman, May 31st, 1981. James's convention document, titled The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the USA, is one of the most stimulating and exciting documents to come out of the American far left. The report synthesizes the conversations with Trotsky, the work in Missouri, the debate inside the Workers' Party, and its author's personal experiences and relationships. In it, James argues that black struggles are rooted in the soil of American democracy, that they enjoy a lasting and profound impact on American society, and that they can inspire, instruct, and transform working-class politics. Black protests would, quote, exercise a powerful influence upon the revolutionary proletariat and, is in itself a constituent part of the struggle for socialism, end quote. James, The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the USA. The report described a nascent movement of religious, secular, local, and national black forces gathering momentum and preparing for victory. It presented a perspective on politics that was more pluralist than Leninist. Virtually every black-run church, newspaper, and neighborhood group in America, James suggested, quote, is dominated by the idea that each organization must in some manner or another contribute to the emancipation of blacks from capitalist humiliation, end quote. Although one critic complained that, quote, it is difficult to find in this coldly incisive analysis the sense of permanent hurt, end quote, the reaction of one of the party's few black members, a Southern-born auto worker, was quite different, quote, he said the workers are the ones we must rely upon, but that didn't mean that Negroes must not do anything until the labor movement actually came forward. The Negro struggle would help bring the workers forward. That was complete for me. I couldn't see how I'd ever think of leaving after hearing him. I was tired and wedged into the party, ... End quote. Charles Denby, Indignant Heart, A Black Worker's Journal. I'm not seeing any good descriptions for Indignant Heart. This particular member, Charles Denby, Cy Owens, joined the Johnson Forest Tendency soon after hearing this speech, and left the Socialist Workers' Party in 1951, along with the majority of the James Dunievskaya group. Denby sided with Raya Dunievskaya during a split within correspondence that took place in 1955, and went on to edit the eponymous newspaper of Dunievskaya's News and Letters group. But the impact of James's 1948 report was felt beyond his immediate circle. His unorthodox approach, the product of intensive study and close observation, offered the Marxist left an imaginative perspective on the relationship between class politics and social movements under advanced capitalism. The idea that autonomous social movements were in themselves a positive good seemed to anticipate a range of campaigns that gained momentum in the late 1950s and 1960s, including the Civil Rights Movement, the Anti-Vietnam War Movement, and the Women's Movement. His approach captured the flavor of much of what was to come, but in the final analysis, James's work on Black America was only one aspect of the tendency's overall analysis of revolutionary politics in the epoch of world capitalism. That's the end of the chapter. I thank you so much for listening.